So, good afternoon, everyone. I would like to welcome you back to our afternoon program. My name is Jan Daniel. I'm a researcher at the Institute of International Relations Prague, one of the co-organizers of the conference, and I will be a chair of this panel, which is titled Freedom of Religion and Women's Rights. We heard a great and uncompromising keynote speech from Professor Hosseini, and that was speaking about different connections between state power, religion, secularism, women's rights, both in the West and in the Middle East and elsewhere. In this panel, we will continue on with this topic, and we will focus in particular on two interconnected issues. First, we will look on women from religious minorities who are particularly vulnerable to state repression and societal pressure. And second, we will also attend to the fact that freedom of religion can at times actually clash with women's rights. In the end, all of our speakers will try to answer quite a difficult question: how to find a way to guarantee equality of all citizens without distinction of gender or faith. We have three speakers to tackle this not really easy question. The first, Elisa Chavez, who is a human rights advisor at Stefanus Alliance International, a Norwegian faith-based NGO. She leads a project examining the intersection of freedom of religion or belief and gender equality, and she's also involved in training and resource development on this thematic intersection of rights. Second speaker, Alimatul Qibtiyah, who is a commissioner at the National Commission on Violence Against Women and a professor in gender studies at Dava and Communication Faculty, Islamic State University in Yogyakarta. And she has been also actively involved at the Center for Women's Studies. And at the community level, she has been actively involved at the research and development and Tarjde division at the National Board of Asia and Muhammadiyah. Welcome. Finally, we have Mariz Tadros, who is a professor of politics and development at the Institute of Development Studies at the University of Sussex in the United Kingdom. She's the author of numerous publications, the latest including What About Us? Global Encounters for Redressing Religious Inequality, and Using Participatory Methods to Explore Freedom of Religion or Belief, Whose Reality Counts. A really intriguing title for me, I have to say. Professor Tadros is, apart from her academic career, also a director of the Coalition for Religious Equality and Inclusive Development, a consortium funded by UK Aid that is comprised of faith-based, human rights and development NGOs, and that is aimed at making international development policy and practice more aware of and responsive to religious discrimination experienced by people living in poverty. So each of our panelists will speak for about 15 to 20 minutes. And after this panel, we will have a short time for Q&A. And I will also ask you to stay in the room for a short concluding remarks by the organizers of the conference. Now, without further ado, I would like to invite Elisa Chavez for her introductory remarks. Elisa?
Thank you. So just to mention that in addition to working in this intersection of rights, freedom of religion or belief, and gender equality at Stefanus Alliance International, I've also for the past year or so served as a thematic advisor to IRFBA's working group on gender, which is now currently co-chaired by Norway and Australia. I would like to start off on a note of sincerely thanking the organizers of today's session, the Institute for International Relations Prague, the Anna Lindh Foundation, and of course also the Czech government with its Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Thank you for bringing us together to discuss and highlight this often invisible topic that also, ironically enough, concerns about half of the global population, which is women's religious freedom. One could perhaps think that something that has such a massive demographic dimension would be an area of more research, of more interest, of more awareness. But unfortunately, the reality is, as it is the case also with many other disciplinary fields, when it comes to women's experiences in society, we know very little. And also when it comes to women's religious freedom, freedom of religion or belief, FORB, or international religious freedom, this is unfortunately not an exception to this. The reasons for why we know so little about women's freedom of religion or belief are complex and multiple. And I will not attempt to address all of the different reasons in my short presentation today, as I've also been asked to share some concrete examples of how this looks like from Iran and Iraq. But I do want to give you a couple of concrete examples, so perhaps you can reflect on how to overcome such obstacles in your own work to champion religious freedom if you are not doing so already. And I also want to note that I brought with me a few booklets that actually goes into details to some of these reasons. I have it both in English and Arabic, so if you are interested, feel free to talk to me afterwards, and I'm happy to share these with you. Now, we know that when researchers, human rights activists, or any other external actor approaches a community, a religious or belief community that is experiencing pressure like discrimination or persecution, they are often met at the door by the faith leaders of said community, as they attempt to understand and address the specificities of such pressure. We also know that the vast majority of leaders of religious communities or people in power around the world in the religious communities are men. And although the malintent is not there to only represent the male experience, the reality is that when the religious leaders are only men in a community, and they are also the only ones that get the opportunity to share their stories of persecution, it easily leads to the invisibility of women's lived experiences and realities of the persecution. This way, the external actors engaging religious communities to address or intervene on the issues of persecution or discrimination tend to only get what I like to call half of the story, which is the male story, and of how the pressure materializes in terms of actual violations because of religious or belief identity. And this is not to say that men's experience of religious freedom or lack thereof is any less important than it is for women, but it is important to underline that men's experiences are just half of the story. And the problem becomes when the male experience is then represented to be the human experience. This has also become evident through the new and conscious effort by some actors in exploring gender disaggregated data when it comes to information and research on violations of freedom of religion or belief, that what we think of as typical FORB violations have been typical FORB violations primarily for men. So there is a need to do more awareness raising to better understand the other half of this story. But for now, let me exemplify how some of the gender differences in violations of religious freedom manifest themselves in the context of the Yazidi community in Iraq. When ISIS-Daesh launched a genocide on the Yazidi community about 9 years ago, their most frequent violation against women and girls, just for being Yazidis, having a Yazidi religious identity, was sexual violence. In contrast, the most frequent violation against the men and boys that had a Yazidi identity was physical violence. And I will not retell the full story of what happened in 2014, as I'm sure most of us here today are painfully aware of the heinous crimes and the horrific details of it. But in short, thousands of Yazidi women and girls were abducted by ISIS soldiers and held as sex slaves. And these women were subjected to rape, forced marriage, and forced conversion, among these other heinous crimes. Now, many survivors were able to flee from captivity in time, but the anticipated reunion with their religious community quickly became problematic. Because according to long-standing Yazidi traditions, Yazidis who engage in pre-marriage intercourse, interreligious marriages, or religious conversion were to be permanently exiled from the community, meaning that many, if not most of the Yazidi women who had been forced to marry the Muslim ISIS soldiers and forced to convert to Islam during captivity were therefore at a considerable risk of being re-traumatized because of these social norms after an initial trauma of abduction, violence, and slavery. However, shortly after the first survivors began returning to the community, the Yazidi spiritual leader, Baba Sheikh, along with the lead spiritual council, ruled an exception to these traditions of punishment by exile if those forbidden acts were forced upon them rather than exercised by free will. They instead decided to welcome the survivors back to the community and created a cleansing ceremony for them with a baptism ritual. And this change became an essential part of the healing process and was crucial to the psychosocial well-being, not only of the survivors, but of the entire community, as they could now re-enter the community with a sense of renewal and acceptance. This is what I would like to call a good practice or a best practice of what concerns the role of religious actors in opening channels of communication towards the integration of women's rights and freedom of religion or belief, or better yet, women's FORB. Those of us who work to advocate for FORB have heard numerous stories of released prisoners of conscience who are celebrated as heroes when they survive captivity and return to their communities, and very rightly so. But I would ask you to note that there are some exceptions to this that disproportionately tend to affect women. Because more often than not, the story of religious persecution for women and girls includes sexual violence. And the shame and the stigma around this steals her opportunity of reuniting and rejoining her family and community. And we have a job to do here as a society in shifting the blame, the shame and the stigma from the offended to the offender. And I mention this because I think it's also highly relevant for FORB advocacy, as sexual violence is often identified as the single most common violation for women and girls when they are targeted for discrimination or persecution based on their religious or belief identity. And in the spirit of the thematic focus of this year's Ministerial, with the rise of authoritarian regimes, the world has also, for the past decade, 2 decades or so, witnessed an emergence of violent, militarist, fundamentalist movements with theologies that not only prohibit religious freedom and pluralism, but also promote an extreme oppression of women. This in turn has escalated organized misogyny to new extremes, and women are often the first target of these fundamentalist forces who seek extreme control over their bodies, as mentioned by our keynote speaker, their reproductive health and rights, or social roles. We also see that women's rights to equality, including FORB, are under increasing pressure from harmful religious fundamentalism all over the world. We see it with Buddhist actors in Myanmar, Hindu actors in India, Islamic in Nigeria, and Christian in the US and Europe, among several other examples. And although this session has a geographical focus on the MENA region, I think it's important to note the diversity of communities in which this is happening, to avoid pitfalls of thinking that this is only a problem in Islam, and also to look within our own communities to identify threats to women's FORB wherever these may exist. A stark example of this is found in Iran, where harmful religious fundamentalism has for decades informed what has lately been described by the UN Special Rapporteur on the human rights situation in Iran as a gender apartheid. With IRFBA's working group on gender, under the leadership of Australia and Norway, we organized a webinar last month through IRFBA to highlight women's FORB violations in Iran and Afghanistan. By the accounts of experts and Iranian human rights activists, we were explained how there is a deeply entrenched and multi-layered gender discrimination targeting women's FORB in Iran. And as most of us know, and was also mentioned by our keynote speaker, all of the women and girls in Iran are forced to wear a hijab or religious dress codes like the kaftan, longer dresses, because of the national Islamic legislation, regardless of their own religion or belief. And this is an obvious violation of non-Muslims women's freedom to practice their religion or belief, like Christians, Baha'is, humanists, atheists, but also, and perhaps less considered, it is an equal violation of Muslims women's freedom to practice their religion, as also some women, Muslim women, would opt out of wearing these garments and the hijab. So the focus of this problem should not only linger at the fact of this Islamic-informed law violates the right of non-Muslim women, but rather on the fact that religious fundamentalism in Iran uses religious freedom as an illegitimate justification to exercise social control on women by implementing a compulsory hijab. And this is not only a misuse of FORB, It is also a FORB violation for both non-Muslim and Muslim women. To share another side of that story from the European context, women's rights are in some countries used as a justification to exercise the same social control of women by prohibiting this hijab, as was mentioned also earlier. And these two examples, although completely contradictory in legal effect, stem from the exact same problematic culture of limiting women's freedoms by restricting what women can and cannot do. And this is another illegitimate example of use of this of women's rights. So the example of the prohibition of the hijab in some countries and the compulsory hijab in other countries shows us that what may be perceived as a threat from gender equality to FORB on one side, or a threat from FORB to gender equality on the other side, might instead be a violation of both of these rights. And during the recent webinar in Iran, it was also highlighted how the current regime is actively deflecting what is happening domestically with other conflicts in the region at the moment, and especially the one we have witnessed in Israel and Palestine over the past 7 weeks. There has in fact been an increase in bills approved by the Iranian parliament to repress women's rights in the name of religious fundamentalism, in the name of this religious fundamentalist interpretation of Islam. And the bills approved in just these past 7 weeks have not only increased in frequency, but also in severity when it comes to women's repression, repression of women's rights, including women's FORB. When it comes to the right to practice one's religion or belief, men in Iran, for example, have the right to interreligious marriages, while women do not. In the cases of divorce, men can get it granted without arguing a legal case, while women cannot. This discrimination continues in custody rights, inheritance rights, political and judicial rights, and all of this gender discrimination in turn is based on this one interpretation of Islamic law. Personally, I was also shocked to learn that the criminal responsibility age of girls in Iran is 9 years old, while for boys it is 15. We see that women and girls in Iran are not only implicitly, but actually quite literally defined as not being equal human beings to men. And this creates a dangerous climate for very gender-specific limitation when it comes to women's fundamental rights and freedom, including women's FORB. So I would also like to use this opportunity to invite you to join us in the IRFBA's working group on gender to look at some of these concrete cases and strategize how we can best address them. The aim of the working group is to highlight the interlinkages between gender and freedom of religion or belief by identifying and raising awareness of how FORB violations can be gender-specific, both towards men, towards women, and also to people of diverse sexual orientation or gender identity. And this is important to make the efforts of intervention more effective as we try to counter FORB violations globally. So if you have any stories to share, please reach out to us so we can connect on that. And we also welcome suggestions for any future webinar or meeting topics where we can either look at a specific country, a specific religious or belief community, or any other thematic focus. I know, for example, that Fiona Bruce recently reached out about forced marriage, which is something that we aim to address early next year. So if you have any questions about the working group on gender or would like to have some more information about it, please come to either me or to the Australian representative in IRFBA, Chiara Porro, after the session, and we will be happy to answer and connect with you. In conclusion, the unfortunate effect of the perceived threat and tension between actors working for women's rights and actors working for religious freedom is that many secular women's rights activists on their side will not address FORB in the work they do to advance women's equality, but rather promote a narrative in which a woman can only be fully free if she renounces her religion. And similarly, FORB activists, or even many religious actors, will not address the gender perspective of FORB violations in the work that they do. But I think that all of us here today agree on the fact that no one should have to choose between their faith and their freedom. The same way, we will not achieve gender equality without also acknowledging and considering FORB as part of the fundamental rights and freedoms for women. We will not achieve FORB for all without a gender perspective. So if we don't invest in a better understanding and solving the cases of violations of women's religious freedom, which is so often invisible, we will, at best, achieve religious freedom for half of humanity. I hope that if you take away anything from this presentation, it is that it is according to the normative framework on the international human rights system, freedom of religion or belief and gender equality can not only coexist as two respective rights, but they are indeed mutually reinforcing of one another. So it is really so timely to have a session during this ministerial conference aimed at highlighting women's religious freedom and their experiences when it comes to discrimination or persecution. So I hope that at the next ministerial, wherever or however it may take place, that we can continue to have this conversation, as there is a considerable need to unpack and understand women's freedom of religion or belief even better. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the great kickoff of the whole panel, and thank you for highlighting the importance of gender perspective and importance of actually understanding the gendered nature of repression in many of the different contexts around the world. So thanks a lot. I would now like to invite Professor Qibtiyah for her remarks.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jane Daniel. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. I'm so honored to be here in this great conference, and thank you very much for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and also the International Religious Freedom of Belief Alliance and the Annalyn Foundation. And also thank you very much, Institute of International Relations Prague, speaker, ladies and gentlemen. I will present the idea of gender issues and feminist identity in Islam. First of all, please let me know about, maybe a little bit, add some information about me, that I'm a professor on gender studies who work in Islamic State University, but right now I'm a commissioner at National Commission Violence Against Women, and also one of member in Fatwa Division in National Board of Muhammadiyah and Aisyah. My book is Feminist Muslim in Indonesia. Okay, Komnas Perempuan established in response to strong public demand, especially from women, for the state to take responsibility for violence against women. So this is a national mechanism to protect women's human rights established by presidential decree. There are a framework that Komnas Perempuan use, which is including CEDAW and also CAT, yeah? And we have 2 mandates and 5 tasks. The first is to build the conducive environment for the elimination of all forms of violence against women, and to increase prevention effort against all forms of violence against women, protection and fulfillment of women's rights in Indonesia. The 5 tasks is promoting public awareness, research and review relevant laws and regulation, monitor and report on violence against women, on women human rights, not only to President for reporting, but also for the international mechanism in United Nations. And also provide input and recommendation to executive, legislative, judicial branches of the government, and develop regulation, develop cooperation regional and international. Okay, there are 4 things that I'm going to present. First, universal values of gender equality in Islam, and also the approaches to understand religious text, example of contentious gender issues in Islam, and debating feminist identity and the movement of thought of feminist Muslim Indonesia. When we're talking about gender equality in Indonesia, historical and philosophical perspective, in Indonesia, many queens and sultanah have made important contribution to nation building. We have a female president. The majority culture adhere the bilateral kinship. What does it mean by bilateral kinship? The child name is not part of parent name, but the child name. Right, my name is Alimatul is my whole name, not one of them is my family name. And Indonesia also genderless. We don't have she or he, hua or here. We only have dia, mean can be men, can be women. Also the other one, Pancasila, as the basis of the state, and also the Indonesian constitution guarantees gender equality and justice. In general, Muslim progressive thought on gender issues are well developed and supported by state and religious institutions. However, gender inequality experienced by women in society in the form of subordination, violence, marginalization, negative labeling, and excessive burden still occurred in society. Principle of gender equality in Islam, there are many religious texts that we can refer. For example, men and women are Abdullah. And also men and women are Khalifatul fil ard, meaning that can be have public and political activities. And also men and women have the same creation, not women not created from the man rib, for example. And also have the same qualities for subjective in the heaven, so there is no, that women are more subjective than male, for example, and also must be responsible for all his her deed in the world. And this is the data gender inequality in Indonesia. Although the universal values of religion is encouraged to be equality and justice, but in reality, there are still many challenges. For example, during the COVID era, women experience almost 4 times for the domestic and caregiver burden in Indonesia. So suddenly, women to be all subject of teacher for the children because they are women during the COVID era. And the second one, also there is still increasing number of gender-based violence that reported in Komnas Perempuan. And for the sexual violence, for example, 9% of the perpetrators are someone who must be a protector, or maybe parents, or lecturer, or maybe a religious leader. So 9%. Maybe it's not much, but 9% for leader, religious leader is much. And also, relating to the leadership, yeah, at university, still less than 30% rector, female rector. In parliament, also less than 30% of female parliament. And professor like me is 4. So 4 male professor and only 1 female professor. So still have a gap between gender equality in Indonesia. We do have studies for 21 years, and there are more than 2.7 million gender-based violence that reported to Komnas Perempuan. So the number is increasing, but the increasing number of reports can be good because maybe there is an iceberg for the people choose silent if they got violent when they report, and then it means they trust about the institution. Okay, and then approaches to religious text. So what should we do for the Muslim feminists to deal with this kind of problem? First, we using Bayani, and the second Burhani, and the third one Irfani. What does it mean by Bayani? We have to mastering our religious text. So if the conservative people ask about what kind of gender issues in Islam, and then we can answer, this is the Hadith, this is the Quran. So we have to mastering the religious text, and also understanding the historical approach of the religious text itself, and also hermeneutic method. And the second one, Burhani. What does it mean? Burhani is research. We use data, we use reality, we use the diversity of human experience. And the last one is Irfani, considering spiritual wisdom and humanity. So by using this kind of 3 steps, Muslim feminists in Indonesia try to work gender equality. And this is the other way how we try to use avoiding misogynic interpretation. Because if we use misogynic interpretation, it will harm one gender. For example, this is the religious text and interpretation. For the interpretation, we see the past scholar and the current scholar. So there is dynamic of thoughts. And then we try to, what is the most relevant today from the interpretation? And in my dissertation, I found 3 categories of approaches on gender in Islam. The first group is textual or conservative people. The second one, moderate or contextual progressive. And the last one is liberal progressive. So the first group tend to rigid, formalistic, and conservative in the idea of interpretation. For people in the middle, usually they're not extreme, progressive, dynamic, contemporary, adaptive to the development of science and the time and inclusive. Liberal progressive, they prioritize the human rationality, open mind, inclusive, skeptical of literal narrative. And there are examples of contentious gender issues in Islam. For example, women participation in public, private, and also political life, violence against women, status of women in property right, right of custody to children, and the right to bodily integrity. So I give the example of my thought relating to the women creation, for example. According to conservative group, they said that according to the text, woman was created from man rib. For moderate people, woman was created from man rib is only an analogy. But for the progressive people, men and women were created from the same essence. The spirit of the creation of women in Hadith contradict with the basic values of the Quran. The second example is polygamy. This is part of very controversial issue among the women activists as well in Indonesia. For example, for the conservative people believe that to have more than one wife is natural because men are naturally polygamous and women are naturally monogamous. The original Islamic teaching is of marriage as polygamous. This is people who are conservative. The moderate people, polygamy is acceptable only where the condition of your universal justice, for example, protecting orphans and widows. For the progressive one, polygamy is unacceptable right now because it is out of date with the present time and cause a lot of problem. The principal marriage in Islam is monogamy. My organization, Muhammadiyah, the principal marriage in Muhammadiyah is monogamy. No discussion on polygamy. Okay, and inheritance, for example. Inheritance, conservative people, female get one, male get two. That conservative one. The moderate one, because men have a double portion, so it should have other type of charity, yeah, to give to female. But for the progressive people, both a man and women should inherit equal portion according to whoever need more, regardless gender, because today many women have the same responsibility as the main breadwinner. Okay, this is very unique and controversial idea about the women leadership. Yeah, in conservative, women cannot be leader of men according to religious text. For moderate people, women can be a leader of adult male, but not in prayer. But for progressive one, women can be a leader of adult men if they have capability, including in prayer, to be imam salat, yeah, for progressive idea. So I just give the example of the right to bodily integrity. We know that religion has a big role in addition to culture and state regulation in determining gender role and identities, including in the regulation of women's bodies. The debate about the hijab is always actual because it has not only religion, but also political. In Iran, for example, the hijab, which there is called a chadar, has become a national identity and a symbol of resistance of Western culture. Meanwhile, in France, the hijab has become a political issue that has caused a heated debate because it is considered contrary to the principle of secularism. For Muslim women, the hijab has various meanings. Hijab can be a symbol of piety, religious observance, rejection to westernization, and women's freedom. The use of the hijab does not automatically describe the personality of the perfect woman as a religious person. Likewise, not all scholars also agree that hijab is an obligation, just a prayer or fasting. The hijab is a distinctive identity. The choice of dress code does not ignore the interpretation of other group dress code. It is necessary to give the negative label. It is not necessary to give a negative label to women who choose to wear the niqab as extremists, or women who choose not to wear it as women who are not pious. The clothes worn should combine harmoniously between aspects of safety, health, yeah, simplicity, politeness, modesty, and applicable local wisdom. Different opinion regarding the limit of aurat. There are three categories, as I mentioned before. First, the opinion that consider the entire women's body to be covered without exception. The second, the entire women's body must be covered except face and palm. The last one, what is commonly sensed is very contextual. What is commonly seen is very contextual, depending on where the usually seen is for a community or society. Because what is commonly seen can be different from one society to another. So it could be in certain context of society or profession showing hair and neck is a common thing to do. Okay, the last one is debating feminist identity and the movement and thought of Muslim feminists in Indonesia. Debating feminist identity, we know that the term Islam and feminism compatible or not. Some groups said that it is compatible. The other group said that not compatible. Why? The first group, for example, the debate connect with the historical polemic between Islamic world and the West, which sees some people perceiving that feminism is the West-based, and Islam has its own values. For example, first group, Islam lies on the line of faith, whereas feminism is a secular term, so they are not compatible. But the other group, Islam and feminism are harmonious. Contemporary scholars who favor the term Islamic feminist, such as Laila Ahmad, Rifat Hasan, Fatimah Mernisi, they argue that Islam and feminism is compatible. Okay, this is one interesting finding from my dissertation. In Indonesian context, more male identify themselves as feminist than female. Why? Because negative stigma associated with the female, but positive labeling go to the male. So if male identify themselves as feminist, they pro gender equality, they support the wife, yeah, they will do something that good thing in the household. But the women, if they identify themselves as feminists, there are negative stigma. For example, they're against the natural quota. They don't want to have baby. They don't want to have family. They are lesbianism and so on and so on. So it makes sense in Indonesian context, yeah, more male identify themselves as feminists than female. The movement of Muslim feminists in Indonesia, yeah, feminism is a movement that is aware to the existence of women problem and attempt to resolve this problem so that women's life become better. Interpretation of religious belief, government, gender ideology, reformist and conservative movement, as well as the dynamic or diversity in the women movement strongly influence the feminist movement in Indonesia. There is a diversity of thought and strategies for achieving the goals and focus of the feminist movement in the world, including in Indonesia. The Muslim feminist thought, the direction of the Indonesian feminist the Indonesian Muslim feminist movement is to strengthen the feminist family. Even though Muslim feminists focus on a lot of the family, that does not mean they don't care about politic affairs. Many family problems are determined by the role of the public. So paying attention to public issues is also inevitable. Characteristic of Muslim feminists in Indonesia include practicing religious belief. They fast, they pray, they do zakah, so practicing religious belief. The second one, perceive men are partner, not enemies. So always historically in Indonesian context, the women movement, male always a partner in their struggle. And Muslim feminists, willingness to do the reproductive tasks. And believing and practicing domestic work and caregiving are the responsibility of both parent and family member, not just mother and girl. Implementing negotiation, not domination, and enable their family members. The last slide, how to do and strengthening gender equality. First, implementing progressive thought, which is women's right in Islam. Also improving education that has diversity perspective, enabling critical thinking, enhancing women leadership, and strengthening the synergy and collaboration of all parties. I think that's my presentation. Thank you very much, and then welcome for discussion.
Thank you very much for this great introduction into Indonesian context, and thank you for the introduction into your own work, including sharing some of the fascinating facts that I had no ideas about. So that was a great presentation. Thank you very much. Our third speaker in this panel, Mariz Tadros, and the floor is yours.
Okay, if you say so. Now that is a challenge. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I am going to start with expressions of gratitude, which I think are very much in their place. I think a huge applause for Robert Rehak. I mean, he's just been incredible. Whether he's here or not, he's just been phenomenal in his support for all of us. And thank you to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Czech Republic. Thank you to the Institute of International Relations for inviting me. Especially thank you to Clément for all the correspondence. A huge thank you to Anastasia. Anastasia has been amazing in all the support she has provided for us. And an enormous thank you to Fiona Bruce, who had invited me to be on the Council of Experts, which has enabled me to be here to learn from you. Professor El-Hosseini talked about the importance of legitimacy. All the examples she talked about was for us to take into account power and legitimacy in how we engage with issues of women's rights and freedom of religion or belief rights. Ms. Elisa Chavez talked about the role of male leaders. This is not about a woman's quarter, the soft fluff stuff that we just have as corner women in the middle of nowhere. She talked about the importance of leadership for this. Professor Qibtiyah reminded us of the importance of reconciling thinking with action and the importance of collective action in bringing about change. I'm going to pick up on something which is, as you have all guessed, we can never talk about men's rights as if men are one group with one agenda, with one set of common interests. I'm going to try and bring in a little bit about the way in which how women in particular who belong to minorities, as everyone has mentioned earlier, especially with Professor Qibtiyah's presentation, FOB is not just an issue of minority women, it is about majority women as well, and it is a struggle for all. But I just want to complement in a way the areas that she has covered by focusing on women who are marginalized on the basis of the intersection of gender, religion, class, caste, ethnicity, because these mean different realities, and if we're going to design policy that actually makes a difference, then just like we can never develop a policy for all men, then we can also need to be mindful of tailoring policies for these differences. I'm going to draw on research that we have done in the Coalition for Religious Equality and Inclusive Development, which is a consortium that was funded by the UK Aid and comprised faith-based organizations, Muslim and Christian, human rights organizations like Minority Rights Group, and then youth movements and women's rights organizations and research centers in all the 12 countries that we worked in research, but then we had 4 or 5 countries of particular areas of research, which I will share in a minute. So I'm going to ask 2 basic questions. How do we know what we know? Because we tend to assume that we can just bring together some people and ask them, what is your situation? And there we have it. We have an agenda of issues that reflect minority women's rights. And I think that is a key problem that we have been having. How is research to be credible, to be relevant? We go in, we parachute into communities. We do research, we come out, and they get nothing out of it. And we try and morally justify it to ourselves by saying, oh, well, when we change policy, they'll be grateful to us. Really? So the question is, how can the way we do research capture the voices that are least likely to be represented? And secondly, how can the research be validated by these communities and be useful to these communities? And so for me, I'm going to take 1 minute to talk about our research methodology to the question of intersecting inequalities experienced by women who are marginalized on the basis of faith, socioeconomic exclusion, and other qualifiers. And the research methodology which we used, I'm sorry, I'm going to jump because I know you guys are very tired and the last thing you want to see is 101 death by PowerPoint or sleep by PowerPoint. But I wanted to talk about we collected qualitative data and quantitative data. Numbers are important. Numbers tell a story. So our qualitative data was based on focus groups that we had in the different communities, and the quantitative data was collected not through surveys, because if you are working in marginalized communities, there is no way they will answer honestly to your questionnaires. I can tell you that after 30 years of experience and a lot of blunders, people are scared. They're terrified how the data will be used, who will use it, and so forth. So that's the second point, is that we needed numbers, but the numbers couldn't come from surveys. So we got the numbers through something which we call participatory ranking, which is that when we have focus groups who are doing, have gathered women and men separately, because we were working in conservative context, then you start to ask them to rank the issues, and then you aggregate this data, because then at least it's their voices. They can say, yes, hold on here, safety will come first for us, or in our case, it's this or that. And the second thing is the co-validation of research findings, which is before we publish reports, we go back to the communities. Have I understood you correctly? Is this what you meant? Because sometimes our interpretive frameworks are completely flawed. We think we've understood them, but we haven't. So where does this point about avoiding parachuting in and out in the way we do research come in? And I think for me, the key issue is legitimacy. And the point here is, who does the research? Are they legitimate in the eyes of the people who this work is being done with, is really, really, really important. So for us, the way we did our research is, when we were working with our local partners in Pakistan, in India, in Nigeria, in Iraq, we said to them, where are the areas where people who are marginalized because of their faith, but they also happen to live in some of the most socioeconomically excluded pockets? And the word pockets is really, really important, because in the majority of cases, religious minorities are not clustered in one area. So we tend to miss them because they are in small pockets. So we ask, where are these pockets? And how can we reach them? And the second question then is, who collects the research? Now, if I go into India and I go into a pocket of a Muslim community, or a pocket of an Adivasi community, I will have no legitimacy to undertake this research, and they will not, for very good reason, trust me. So this is how what we do is we identify community development leaders from these pockets, people who have the trust and legitimacy of their community, who are already known to the community, and who are willing to learn research methods, participatory research methods. And this is how we avoid parachuting in and out, because these majority women and these women and men in these communities then use the skills, the research skills they have learned to continuously support their communities. I'm happy to come back to this point later because of limitation in time. But this way, at least we're building capacity that can then be useful to the communities. So I want to just jump to some of the findings to talk about the differentiated experiences of different marginalized groups by referring to Pakistan, but these issues could also apply to India. We have them, the quantitative data for India, so this is just not so people feel that we're picking on one particular country, but because of limitations of time, we can only use one example. So for example, when we looked at the experiences of Hazara Shia, intersection of ethnicity, race, because they look different racially, gender, and geography. This is a high security spot. We found that for Hazara Shia, it was the threat of violence and harassment pertaining to their highly securitized situation living in Balochistan on the borders of Iran. That massively affected their situation. And what we need to remember here is that this has a knock-on effect in the broader community's ability to help. So people were very scared to employ Hazara Shia women because they wanted to avoid trouble with the government, security trouble with the government. But if you look at the Ahmadiyya women, they talked about very different kinds of priorities. They talked about issues to do with not being able to come out in public and say, we are Muslim. This is very, very interesting because in most cases, minorities want to come out and say we are a minority, or we are Kakai, we are Sabian, we're Christian, we're Muslim, and so forth. But in their case, it was the right to identify themselves as of a majority religion, because the majority religion did not see them as belonging to that religion. And so they couldn't pray in the mosques, even though they felt they were Muslim, because they were seen as outside the remit of Islam. And here we're talking about a different kind of sexual harassment. No, sorry, not sexual harassment, it's the opposite. It's verbal and vilified harassment in public space. Because here, because they're fully veiled in a particular veil that is different from how the majority dress, they become the targets of smearing and vilification. Very different to the sexual harassment that we see Christian women, Christian Dalit women, and Hindu Dalit women experience in Pakistan, which is of a more sexual nature. Why? Because Christian women do not veil in Pakistan. And why? Because Hindu women are wearing the sari, so people in the microbuses, in the minibuses, would touch their tummies and say, well, aren't you fair game? Or something equivalent to that. So here we're talking about different kinds of experiences of minorityness that women are experiencing. It is not one and the same. Interestingly, the experience of Christian and Hindu Dalit women was different to Ahmadiyya and Hazara Shias, because belonging to a Dalit, which is the intersection of caste and class, meant they had to go to work, even if they didn't want to, for a living. Their families expected them to go out and work. And if it was the case of Christians as domestic laborers or sewage workers, and if it was the case of Hindu women in the Sindh province, then they worked in what was associated with bonded labor to do with the brick-making industries. So here, again, different kinds of experiences of encroachment and inequalities. Now, I just want to jump to this impossible to read table, which is, I was going to try and fib my way into this and say it's impossible to read so that you can go to the report and look at the numbers. But I have to be honest with you, it's just my technological incompetence. But what we do is then we aggregate the data to try and look at patterns. So really important to start with a contextual, situated understanding, but then we need to understand the patterns so that we can develop policy. And here you would see, this is for Iraq, where we worked with the Assyrians and Chaldeans, because it's impossible to just lump all Christians together under the Chaldean church, because that's not how the Christian communities in Iraq work. So we had one for the Assyrians, one for the Chaldeans. We also had the Kakais and the Sabians, and we also had the Shabak, and we also had Yazidis, of course. We missed out on the Baha'is because the partner we were unable to get through. But the point is, if you look at that, you will see some very interesting numbers being aggregated from the participatory ranking exercises. It makes us realize that areas that we take for granted, like education, makes it on the top list for so many as an area of acute need for, and education here, people will always focus on the curriculum, but it's not just about curriculum. It is about feeling safe at school. It's about not being subject to bullying and vilification. It's about not fearing sexual harassment because you belong to a minority group. So if we look at the cross-country comparisons, in other words, if we bring together the work from India, from Iraq, from Pakistan and other countries, what are the emerging patterns? Religious discrimination is number one. This is really important because some feminists would say, well, the issues you have raised, sexual harassment, education, and so forth, everybody suffers from that. What is so specific about the experience of minority women when these are issues to do with patriarchal inequality that we see around the world? And there you have it. It's the first answer. It's that these women experience forms of inequality that are specific to their identity as otherized. And by otherized, I mean that they're not perceived as one of us, that the majority women do not see them as one of us. So there is that additional complexity of experiencing inequality which makes it different. Now, education, as mentioned, isn't just about curriculum. Actually, very few of the women and men talked about curriculum. Their issue was about unfair opportunities, issues of access, issues of prejudice in the classroom. Employment was very important because it is about survival. And here we see issues of inequality and prejudice coming to the fore. Just one very small example. When COVID struck in Pakistan, the first thing middle-class families that employed Christian Dalit women as domestic servants did was fire them. This is not a context where you can talk about, where's my medical insurance, where's my pension? You're fired, that's it. You've lost your livelihood. So issues of employment become very important. Lack of safety is a critical issue, and that may mean different things, but the fact that they are sometimes so visibly different because they dress differently. And here I'd like to go back to Professor Hosseini's point that it's not about the length of your cloth. You get harassed in Pakistan if you're a Ahmadi woman because you've got too much cloth. And you get harassed because you've got too little cloth. I mean, it is a situation where we have to understand this as a case of, because you are a woman who is dressed differently, you become conspicuous to the rest of the society of whom you belong to, even if you're not practicing. And I think the issue of safety is a really important one because it affects every aspect of your life. Now, I think we've talked about different approaches, collective action, leadership, and so forth. I want to talk about developing a FOB-sensitive gender equality agenda, and because I come from a development background, if there's one policy I'm going to encourage everyone Monday morning, because I'm hoping you would take tomorrow off. When you go back to your offices and think about Monday morning, is there is not a single country except perhaps Afghanistan that doesn't have a gender strategy. And the question now becomes, how do we use the gender and development strategy to incorporate issues of diversity? I think I can probably speak for everyone here that we say we don't need any more frameworks. We don't need any more models. We don't need any more toolkits. We don't need any more, we're all tired of that. So the question is, how do we incorporate it in the existing gender strategies in ways that make sense? And this is where I'm going to talk very proudly about my government, or my country, United Kingdom, where just last week, the first time ever in the history of in the UK international development policy, they mentioned minority women. Some people would say, what took them so long? Let's not go there. But the point is, I'm reading this from the actual text. This is an open access document that Fiona mentioned yesterday. And the importance of this, as Fiona mentioned yesterday, is it's across political parties. In other words, we hope that whatever changes happen in future, at any point in the future, decades and centuries, this remains a commitment that is operationalized. And in it, it says, I'm just going to go into the bold bit, proven solutions will be scaled up, reaching those most at risk of being left behind, such as women and girls with disabilities, LGBTQI people, adolescent girls, and... Thank you. Finally, that recognition is really important. Yes. That recognition is very important because once you have it in a policy paper, then you can start to push for its operationalization. Now, I'm going to start with the good news, and then I'm not going to say the bad news, but I'm just going to say the future good news, the good news that is waiting to become good news. So the good news is that for gender and development, or the area of women in development, we have, across the world, 50 years of sustained excellent progress in developing what does it mean to develop a health system that understands women's needs. What does it mean for educational policy to address the gender gap? What does it mean to address infrastructure? What does it mean to address nutrition? So that exists. We do not have to come up with a gender-sensitive policy. That is the good news, because these indicators are already there. But, and you probably did realize there is a but coming up. And I'm finishing, I promise. We don't have, within that gender and development set of indicators, ones that are actually sensitive to the realities of women who are marginalized on the basis of religion or freedom, basis of religion or belief. And the reason why I say belief, it's because it also includes indigenous women's sacred beliefs. And the point is, the current gender indicators work well to bring to attention the different kinds of needs of women with disabilities, women in geographically remote rural areas, but they don't actually work for recognizing how when women who belong to socioeconomically, religiously marginalized communities cite religious discrimination as number one, what does that mean in how we incorporate it in our gender indicators for inclusive development? That is the work that I think we have to do. And when I say we have to do, it has to be done with partners, it has to be contextualized, it has to be embedded in existing development frameworks, so it makes sense to those who will implement it. I'm going to stop there, and thank you very much for your attention at so late in the day. Thank you.
Wow, many thanks for such an energetic talk. I do actually think it woke everyone up as they needed, so thanks a lot. So we are quite short on time, unfortunately, so I will allow for one question from the audience. And yes, I see it right there.
Thank you. Actually, it's not a question, but rather a comment. So the example, given by Mariz on the majority women's, privilege and the access to social services, it made me realize, and reflects on my country context, which is Myanmar, because in Myanmar, we have this, existence of the legal, framework, which is so restrictive and and contradicting to one another, and it creates actually a legal loophole, which is often missed by many of the policymakers. I just wanted to explain a little bit, on that one, because in Myanmar we have a mandatory, status of identifying your race and religion on your ID cards. So meaning that if you are from the minority, religion, then your access to the ID card, which is related to assessing other social services, are very much limited. So in a way that it forces some of the minority women, for example, like Hindu women, to register themselves, as Buddhists, rather than the Hindu, which is their, denominations. And this sort of misidentifications really leads to further complications with the other, restrictive law, such as the very infamous race and religion law, which particularly protects the rights of Buddhist women only. So meaning that, technically speaking, from legal perspective, you are a Buddhist, but if you marry another Hindu through the a customary law, then nothing is, going to happen. If your marriage is, happy and, it's like happily together, maybe, but when certain things happen with your marriage and then you end up in a divorce, let's say in a court, which then it ends up as you being identified as a Buddhist. And then, your legal rights and other things, then it becomes complicated, because in that law, it actually, affects the other, Buddhist, partners' rights mainly, especially on, your rights to, child control and property, rights and etc. So that's like some of the legal loophole, only protecting, the particular group, and it makes, further complications and systemic barriers to access other rights. So just wanted to highlight on that. Thank you.
Okay, in that case, please do join me in a concluding round of applause to our panelists. But if I can just keep you here for 2-3 more minutes, I would like to invite Mr. Klemanster, the scientific organizer of the conference, for his short concluding words.
Thank you, Daniel. And I will be brief because I don't have anything substantial to add to what has been said by this afternoon speakers. So I think what has been discussed today illustrates the notion of intersectionality. So you have women from religious minorities are victims of oppression as women and as members of minorities. So this is why we have to stay vigilant against weaponization of these issues against each other. And I wanted to thank also all the people involved in the organization of this conference, but Jiří Mach, Director of Operation at Institute of International Relations, will do this in a minute. So I will just thank you, Jiří, for all the good work and let you express my gratitude to the IIR team, the speakers, our partners, and of course, the audience for its invitation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Clement, and for the very concluding words, Mr. Jiří Mach.
Thank you very much, Honza, for these kind words. First of all, I would like to thank all of you, mainly the participants who have come and listened and have tried to further the intercultural and interfaith dialogue through participating in this conference. So the biggest thanks go to you, the participants. Of course, I cannot forget our speakers for their interesting thoughts. So thank you very much for doing this, and to all the speakers that have preceded me. Thank you very much for making this possible. Of course, I cannot forget the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Czech Republic for hosting us in these beautiful premises. Special thanks goes to Ambassador Řehák for his cooperation on this endeavor, and Ms. Petra Kaplanova, who has been through the thick of it all with us and helped us immensely. Thanks also go to the Diplomatic Academy frequentants that have helped us along the way with the floor management and have been ushering you throughout the conference to take your seats, so thank you. Obviously, huge thanks go to the hospitality personnel at the MFA who have provided us with a wonderful catering and the food that we all feasted on. I think that always makes a conference memorable. Of course, I would like to thank all the partners, the IRF Secretariat for providing us with the means to do this, the Rent Wednesday partners for their cooperation, and the Templeton Foundation as well. Last but not least, I would like to thank the colleagues from the IIR, Ivana and Staska, who have been in contact with most of you and made this possible through the countless emails and hours spent on this. And obviously all the stagiaires that have made this possible as well. So huge thanks. And as I said in the beginning, the thanks go to all of you for making this possible. Please give yourself a round of applause and have a safe flight home. Thank you so much.
So a very final words then from Mr. Robert Řehák.
Don't worry, I'm not going to speak. Just announcement. I would also like to thank Jiří Mach from Institute of International Relations because he was responsible for the whole IR team, so please applause to him. We concluded this part of the conference, and there is a small private meeting of the people who were here from the beginning at the IRFBA, and it will be in the Miro Hall. I hope we fit there. With all others who have to go or came just for this part, women's rights, I would like to thank you very much for attendance, and please let the topic live and help us to promote those issues in all coming year. Thank you very much. The strategic discussion is in Miro. Thank you very much again.